I entered the Philosophy, Cosmology and Consciousness program in search of a beautiful critique of our times, as expressed by the following sentiment, which I carried with me into this program. It strikes me that providing hospice to a dying modern worldview is just as important to human evolution and survival as is living the possibilities of a different way forward into being. And I would only hope to discover a language of reconciliation sufficient to the task. I must be clear here when I say beautiful, beautiful critique, for the beauty I speak of isn't something nice or pretty or any of our domesticated ideas of life bound up in a cage. Life is beautiful, and so there is also terror. The beautiful critique I seek is one which doesn't wallow in postmodern angst about the shadow of self-reflective consciousness, that self-satisfied embrace of misanthropy, which is the fear and hatred of humanity, which is supposed to somehow keep us safe from ourselves. The beautiful critique isn't afraid of the terror which accompanies beauty. It stares straight into the face of these strange days of death, which doesn't die, and smiles. For our existence exhibits a great many qualities, and the aesthetic and emotional response to life involves all of those qualities, not just those which we may find desirable or attractive. Life involves the perception of finitude, of death and loss, the ultimately mysterious nature of the universe with all the unknown, the unexpected. To attempt to eradicate the wild, the mysterious, the uncivilized is to fail to acknowledge beauty's depths and has invariably led to the truly ugly. Now, misanthropy can hide in the strangest places. It's not just that which resides in the pit of the stomach of the activist working for improvement of what seem like intractable situations, such as the sixth mass extinction, the conflict in Palestine and Israel, the mockery of democracy in a world so riven by structurally embedded inequalities. One of the more curious places where I detect the fear and hatred of humanity is in the idea of salvation, the millennial idea that there will come a time, and depending on who you consult, it involves different variables, but there will come a time when we are free from this horrendous fallen state of being human, when finally at last we will have escaped our hideous condition of decay, disease, death, and the problem of free will, which seems to bring with it so much suffering. Hence the title of this talk, There is No Salvation from the Myth of Salvation. I mean that in every way you can read it, that the myth of salvation or escape will not actually provide salvation, or that there's no escaping this myth of salvation, the myth of escaping or of a change to our condition. And I suppose my ideas cavort about in the grayer areas of the latter interpretation, that there may indeed be something that needs to change, but perhaps it's simply our orientation towards the human condition and inhabiting bodies and the multitude of mistakes that we can make, or where we judge strictly, harshly, and see the world in sharp black and white terms. I believe we inhibit the possibility of a real, live, fundamental transformation involving something much greater than ourselves. We may think that razor-sharp boundaries protect us, but actually, they interfere with the fact of the unity of existence. And of course, I'm not talking about a patriarchal notion of unity, which is equated with uniformity and consuming the other in the obliteration of any distinctions between self and other. Rather, I propose that we accept the terror which accompanies beauty, that we find the courage to accept that, yes, bad things happen, and they happen to good beings, to innocent beings. The rejection of the existence of the unwanted, the bad, has the eerie side effect of rejecting the existence of the good, of that which is salutary and promotes the flourishing of life. And to qualify, I'm not speaking of some kind of absolute moral relativism. I'm more speaking to the problem of the necessity of an ethical orientation. My study of archetypal astrology has proven invigorating because the concept of the archetype allows that good and bad are not ontologically separate, but reside in the same place. It has also shown me that it is possible to organize consciousness in so many contradictory ways, and that that is a part of the structure of reality. The flexibility of perception is not a human mistake. More importantly for me, however, the study of archetypal astrology has shown me that something like the noble aspirations of collective self-governance, for example, democracy, are just that, noble aspirations, which reflect not a merely human-bound perspective, but cosmic principles, cosmic forces. I can more clearly see the limitations of critique alone, which in current discourse seems hell-bent on reinforcing an outdated worldview that deems the world static and unmoving, or any movement at all, as quite by predictable clockwork. And so I'm grateful to the work of Richard Tarnas and everyone in the archetypal astrological community for helping me discover a cosmos in process, feeding a beautiful critique. Imagine democracy not as a fixed ideology, but as a process that is happening all the time. It is inventing and reinventing itself in each moment. I think it can be difficult, but try to wrap your head around the idea that our actions in the present moment create. What is democracy? Not the dictates of some old men a few millennia ago or even a few centuries ago. The human being alone did not invent democracy. The cosmos is creating it with us right now. If we choose to participate, of course. But wait a minute, is this the sweetly rancid smell of salvation I detect? I doubt it because I cannot promise an outcome that will be good or even workable. Who the hell knows? But a change of perspective on the rapidly deteriorating state of human affairs can certainly open the way for reconciliation to happen. This is hospice work. This is facing the shit and accepting that it's there. And to allow death to have a chance to die again. Otherwise, it's difficult to notice that the salvation one seeks is already at hand, fully present and available right here and now. It's not in some distant future or when some savior will descend from the skies. I just can't wait. Either in the form of a resurrected Jesus or these poor indigo children. I don't know if you've heard these incredibly enlightened children born. It's just like we're talking as if they too are not subject to karma, as if they are somehow positioned outside of history. When we begin to look in this different way, embracing our karma, and by karma I mean our actions, and all its terror and its beauty, the path to liberation is detectable within current events. Entering into the present moment, all the messiness we would rather escape suddenly contains incredible generative power. But we must be willing to be transformed ourselves in the encounter. Yes, we humans will always have limited vision, but why must we then cast ourselves into hell? Just because life isn't easy, it's not a static state of perfection, but a non-linear, ever-mysterious process of happening, which requires our care and our tending our presence. And if I were to argue for a fundamental change to help alleviate unnecessary suffering, I suppose in this moment I would argue for presence. Being present to the other in all its expression, and the other lives within each of us too. The courage it takes to be so vulnerable is an uncommon one, I find. And let me be explicit, for it is not the oppressed parts of ourselves or the oppressed parts of creation who need to find the most courage, but very much the oppressor within, and the oppressor classes. Helping oppressors to see themselves, and thus the other, seems to require a third-party witness in entrenched cases, because the pattern of violating is set, and the cycle of violence renders the transgression permanent, as victims and perpetrators exchange roles with each other over time. And so I find myself now responding to a call to eldership. Not elderhood, as if designated by some kind of linear temporal path, but eldership in the sense of one who treats all beings with dignity and respect, one who knows that cultural healing must not be based on the notion that community is a private clubhouse, and only some people's experiences are welcomed while others are trivialized. Oh yeah, I must open my heart to the lament of the privileged, financially wealthy person sobbing over the loss of an idea of what a golf course should be, sacrificed to ensure a viable biosphere. And I admit, cultivating this kind of deep compassion requires dedication, persistence, forgiveness of oneself. Believe me, I want to throttle people sometimes, but the elder's not condescending either, because the fact of that person's privilege is not their creation alone. A whole society has created the situation. I must recognize a larger context. This approach of eldership comes out of the social change work of Jungians Arnold and Amy Mendel, who have developed an intriguing method of working with collectives, facilitating large group transformation using conflict and diversity, which they call world work. To accomplish world work, the Mendels describe the need to develop the skill and awareness to facilitate interactions between people in a way that is lovingly supportive of all parties, not taking sides, and allowing the truth of what each voice and each view is trying to communicate. It's a way of allowing all who's present to belong to the conflict at hand, to be valid, so as to not be excluded and then act out in various dysfunctional ways in the attempt to be heard, seen, and loved. And this need to be heard, seen, and loved can surround the most juvenile things. My hypothetical golfer may rail, I can't have perfectly green fairways because it's poisoning the river. But the juvenility of the desires which are presented is irrelevant. My judgment about that is irrelevant, because what will allow a relational system to move in a more healthy direction is allowing for everything to belong in a deeply democratic process. Because ultimately, everything does belong, whether it's beautiful or despicable. It belongs. Everything has a place, a role to play, wisdom to communicate, and we ignore any voice at our own peril, because it will manifest sooner or later in a perhaps distorted timbre. And I think that making space where the truth can be heard and heard deeply will allow an individual to actually hear themselves and see themselves in ways previously unknown. No guarantee of salvation, of course, for life is messy, but there is at least the possibility of a transformation. Because the reason to include the voice of the marginalized and the traditional power holder alike is to make it possible for a transformation to happen, a realization to happen. In the right container, with the right eldership, and a great many transformations and understanding can happen as our stories about the other fall away into the reality of the presence of the other. Again, I think that coming into the presence of the other is absolutely key to navigating these transitional times in any way which can be thought of as successful. World work seems to activate and involve the mythic and emotional dimensions in the transformation of conflict, and perhaps some form of it can serve both as hospice and provide a catalyst for a new iteration of the experiment with collective self-governance, democracy. Indeed, Carl Jung made a long study of alchemy, and he observed that, quote, the greater the tension between pairs of opposites, the greater the energy that comes from them, the stronger its constellating power. Here, he is speaking about individual psychology, but when I take this view into the collective level and think of culture as analogous to ego, playing with that idea, I wonder how one can elicit what Jung called the tertium non datur, the third thing not given, the reconciling third, not logically foreseeable, which is characteristic of a resolution in a conflict situation when the tension between opposites has been held in consciousness. The processes of world work represent something like bringing all the opposites into consciousness and holding them there as a wise elder would, with dignity and respect for all. Quoting Jung again, as a rule, it occurs, this third thing occurs, when the analysis has constellated the opposites so powerfully that a union or synthesis of the personality becomes an imperative necessity. This situation requires a real solution and necessitates a third thing in which the opposites can unite. Here the logic of the intellect usually fails, for in a logical antithesis there is no third. The solvent can only be of an irrational nature. In nature, the resolution of opposites is always an energic process. She acts symbolically in the truest sense of the word, doing something that expresses both sides, just as a waterfall visibly mediates between above and below. And it is my living question, can we elicit this third thing, this connecting fabric, a thing which I maintain isn't given because it's already there. We're already connected. We are already in communion, even if it's non-local, just as a cosmological condition. In fact, I'm now curious to investigate how institutionalized prejudices may be imitating and taking the place of social bonds which would otherwise serve true collective security. I imagine that this exploration of negotiation and dialogue with harsh human political realities will naturally feed into other ideas I have for developing biocracy, or a democracy inclusive of the non-human world. For again, the revelation of a paradoxical salvation seems to require the presence of the other in all its forms, devastatingly beautiful, ugly, pretty, always welcomed, or previously marginalized, because, as I like to phrase the phenomenon of psychological projection, you know I am not the devil I make you out to be. Now once again, please, with a poem by the poet, scholar, practitioner of nonviolence, Barbara Deming, and she penned this in 1940. It's short. Have been not admitting at all to be present and given. Dreaming, if love, possible or impossible because of other person, but actual, not dreamt. And I no more the victim of than anyone of any love. This is not the devil. It is the devil who says, this is the devil. We'll look at everything. We'll not turn eyes down or sidewise. For it is not for me to say where the hope lies, where death is made life. This stiff shroud of ice, this mock of bloom, this weight, this glittering load with the appearance of feather is promise given of spring, this anything but green, this load from above, most icy, most harsh. Yet there it is, spring.